A cleaner doesn't walk into my office unless she's stealing. The words sliced through the top floor of Sterling Biotech so sharply that even the soft hum of the air vents seemed to pull back. Naomi Brooks froze beside the walnut desk, one hand still holding a folded dust cloth, the other hovering near an old cream-colored envelope she had just placed in the center of the polished surface. For half a second, no one moved. The glass walls of the executive suite reflected everything too clearly. The city lights beyond the windows, the white orchids near the bookshelf, the silver pen holder aligned with almost cruel precision, and Victoria Sterling standing in the doorway with one heel angled forward like she had caught a trespasser in the middle of a crime. Naomi's blue cleaning cart sat just outside the office, one wheel still spinning from where she had left it in a hurry. The faint smell of lemon disinfectant mixed with cold recycled air and expensive perfume, and somewhere down the hall, a copier kept printing as if this moment belonged to another world. Victoria stepped inside, slow and controlled, her cream blazer flawless, her expression tighter than the knot of silk at her throat. She did not raise her voice, and that somehow made it worse. "I asked you a question." Naomi swallowed and lifted her chin. She knew better than to speak too fast in rooms like this. Words always sounded guiltier when they rushed. "I came in to leave something on your desk, ma'am." Victoria's eyes dropped to the envelope, then back to Naomi's face, and whatever patience she had carried into the room vanished. "You entered a locked executive office during business hours, touched property that does not belong to you, and now you expect me to believe you were doing me a favor?" Naomi felt the heat rise in her neck, not from shame exactly, but from the familiar sting of being seen through a story someone else had written for her before she ever opened her mouth. Outside the glass wall, Victoria's assistant had gone still at her station. A young analyst walking past slowed for one glance, then looked away the way people did when power turned ugly in public. Naomi set the dust cloth down carefully on the edge of the desk, as if one wrong movement might become evidence too. "The envelope was wedged behind the cabinet by the window," she said. "I found it while I was cleaning the baseboards. It looked important." Victoria gave a dry, disbelieving laugh that never reached her eyes. "Important enough for you to bring yourself all the way in here." Her gaze traveled over Naomi's gray uniform, the rubber gloves tucked into her apron pocket, the sensible shoes damp from mopping the marble hallway. "Do you have any idea how many people would love access to this office?" Naomi did not answer that. She knew the answer was not really meant for her. It was meant for the room, for the watching eyes beyond the glass, for the invisible court that always assembled when someone like Victoria needed to prove she was still in control. Naomi looked once at the envelope. The paper was old, heavier than normal office stock, the edges softened with age. Across the front, written in dark ink that had bled just slightly into the fibers, were 5 words. "For Victoria. Read alone." Naomi had seen enough offices, enough secrets, enough people pretending not to notice what had been left behind, to know this was not junk mail. "I was leaving it and heading out," she said quietly. "That's all." Victoria took another step closer, close enough now that Naomi could see her own reflection in the glass of the framed awards on the wall behind her, small and dark against all that steel and light. "No," Victoria said. "That is not all. People do not cross lines like this unless they think the rules do not apply to them." Naomi held her breath for one beat, then another. The whole floor felt suspended in white light and silence. And on the desk between them, the old envelope waited like it already knew one of them was about to be wrong. Victoria Sterling did not touch the envelope. She looked at it the way a person looks at a stain on white fabric, something small that somehow felt offensive simply for existing. Then she turned toward the glass wall and said, without lowering her voice, "Marlene, call Human Resources and Security." The assistant at the desk outside startled as if someone had snapped a ruler across the air. "Right away, Miss Sterling." Naomi felt the whole floor shift around that sentence. Not physically, socially. It was in the way. People pretended not to listen while listening to every word. In the way the junior analyst at the end of the corridor suddenly found a reason to study his phone. In the way the overhead lights made every polished surface feel colder than it had a minute earlier. Victoria moved around the desk and set her leather portfolio down with a clean, deliberate sound. "I do not tolerate boundary issues in this company," she said, "especially in executive spaces. Naomi kept her hands visible at her sides. Her pulse had started to pound now, low and steady, like a fist against a locked door, but her face remained still. She had learned that stillness years ago, the hard way, in places where any extra emotion was treated like proof of guilt. I found the envelope behind the cabinet, she said again. That is all I did. Victoria gave her a thin smile, one with no warmth in it at all. That is interesting, because from where I am standing, it looks like you made a decision that was far above your position. The last word landed with special care. Position. Naomi glanced once toward the cabinet by the window, the narrow gap between the wall and the dark wood credenza, the spot where her mop handle had knocked loose a little drift of dust and the edge of that old paper. She could still picture it, hidden there like something forgotten on purpose. It had your name on it, Naomi said. I thought you should have it. Victoria folded her arms. And I thought the cleaning staff understood that private offices are private for a reason. The office smelled sharper now, less like orchids and polish, more like static before a storm. Marlene rose from her chair and approached the doorway, holding a tablet too tightly against her chest. Human resources is on the way, she said softly. She avoided Naomi's eyes when she said it. Naomi did not blame her. Buildings like this were full of people who knew exactly when courage might cost too much. Victoria turned slightly, so her voice would carry beyond the office without looking like she meant it to. Let this be clear. Access is earned here. It is not assumed. And curiosity is not part of janitorial duties. Naomi heard the word janitorial the same way she had heard words like girl and help and those people before, polished on the outside, ugly underneath. For one brief second, anger flashed hot behind her ribs. Not loud anger. The older kind. The tired kind. The kind that came from realizing someone had measured your worth before you ever spoke. She reached into the pocket of her apron and drew out her gloves, folding them neatly in half. I was not curious, she said. I was careful. Victoria looked almost amused by that. Careful would have been leaving it with reception. Naomi's eyes lifted to hers. Careful was making sure it did not disappear again. That changed something. Only slightly, but enough. Victoria's expression stiffened, just for a breath, as if the sentence had touched a wire she had not expected Naomi to find. Before she could respond, two people stepped off the elevator at the end of the hall, one from security in a navy blazer, the other from human resources with a badge clipped to a silk blouse. Their footsteps softened over the carpet runner as they approached. Naomi looked once more at the old envelope resting untouched in the center of that immaculate desk. Then she untied her apron strings, folded the apron over her arm, and understood with perfect clarity that whatever happened next, the letter had already done what it came there to do. It had made the room afraid to breathe. The woman from Human Resources introduced herself as Dana Ellis, though her voice was so careful it sounded less like an introduction and more like an apology that had not found the courage to become words. The security officer stayed half a step behind her, hands folded in front of him, expression blank in the professional way people wore when they knew something was wrong, but had decided their paycheck needed silence more than their conscience needed air. Naomi stood beside the desk with her apron folded over her arm and watched Dana glance once at Victoria, once at the envelope, then quickly back to the floor. It was all there in that one glance. No one needed an explanation. Power had already explained everything. Ms. Brooks, Dana said gently, we are going to ask you to step away from the executive office while we review what happened. Naomi nodded. Of course. Victoria remained near the window, one hand resting on the back of her chair, the city skyline rising behind her in silver rectangles and fading afternoon light. There is not much to review, she said. An employee without clearance entered my office and handled private material. Naomi felt the words settle over her like dust on glass. Thin at first, then impossible to ignore. Handled private material. She had picked up a letter from the floor and set it in plain view. That was all. But in rooms like this, language had a way of changing shape depending on whose mouth it came from. Dana turned toward Naomi as if trying to offer her a softer exit than the one Victoria had chosen. Please come with me. Naomi did not move right away. Her eyes went once more to the envelope lying untouched in the center of the desk, old paper against polished walnut, quiet against all that accusation. Then she looked at Victoria. You should read it before you decide what kind of person I am, she said. Victoria's jaw tightened. I have already decided that. The answer landed so cleanly that even Dana flinched. For a moment the office seemed to shrink around the sentence. Outside the glass walls, the floor had gone unnaturally still. Phones were being held lower. Keyboards had gone quiet. Everybody knew this was no longer about protocol. It was about a line someone believed had been crossed by the wrong person. Naomi drew in one slow breath. The air tasted faintly of lemon polish and coffee that had gone cold somewhere nearby. She had worked in enough towers, hospitals, and law firms to recognize the difference between a mistake and a verdict. This was a verdict. So she inclined her head once, not submissive, not defiant, just done. Then you did not decide, she said softly. You assumed. She walked with Dana out into the corridor, passing Marlene's desk, passing the wall of framed magazine covers where Victoria smiled beside headlines about innovation, leadership, and the future of American medicine. Naomi noticed absurd details because that was what her mind did under pressure. A coffee ring on a legal pad. A cracked thumbnail on the intern by the printer. A faint smear on the chrome elevator door she had missed during the last round. The ordinary things looked sharper when dignity was leaving a room. Dana led her toward a small conference room near the service hallway, but before they reached it, Naomi stopped at her cleaning cart. She took off her company badge and set it carefully on the top shelf beside the spray bottle and the stack of fresh microfiber cloths. Her fingers lingered there for 1 second. 5 months on the night crew. 3 floors assigned. Never late. Never written up. Never once seen until now. Ms. Brooks, Dana said, lowering her voice. Do you want to call someone? Naomi shook her head. No, ma'am. Her voice stayed steady, but her chest felt hollow in a way that had nothing to do with fear. It was older than fear. It was the ache of being made small by people who would call it procedure. She draped the folded apron over the handle of the cart and looked back down the corridor toward the office one last time. Through the glass, Victoria was still standing by that desk, rigid and bright and certain, while the envelope sat between them like a truth too patient to hurry. Funny thing about clean rooms, Naomi said, almost to herself. They show every fingerprint once the light hits right. Then she turned toward the service elevator, and behind her, on the other side of all that glass, the woman who thought she had removed a problem still had not touched the letter. The service elevator arrived with a soft mechanical chime that sounded almost polite, as if the building itself preferred not to witness what had just happened. Naomi stepped inside with Dana Ellis, and the doors slid shut on the executive floor, sealing away the glass offices, the skyline, the orchids, and the woman who had looked at her as though dignity were a privilege with a password. Inside the elevator, the light was flatter, the air warmer, touched by the faint smell of cardboard, floor wax, and metal that had carried freight longer than people. Dana pressed the button for the lower level and then clasped her hands, saying nothing for a few seconds. Naomi stood beside her blue cart, fingers resting lightly on the handle, eyes on the floor indicator as the numbers dropped. 27. 26, 25. Each one felt like the building putting her back where it thought she belonged. I am sorry, Dana said at last, quietly enough that the apology could still pretend it was not disloyal. Naomi looked over at her. Dana was maybe in her early 40s, neat hair, sensible shoes, tired eyes that had probably learned years ago how to survive polished cruelty by naming it policy. For what? Naomi asked. Dana hesitated. For how it happened. Naomi gave the faintest nod. It happened exactly how people like her think it should. Dana looked down. The elevator kept descending. Naomi's reflection in the brushed steel doors appeared and disappeared each time the overhead light flickered with the motion. Gray uniform. Dark eyes. Hair pulled back tight for a shift that had started at 4 in the afternoon and was supposed to end at midnight. She thought of her mother for no reason that made sense, and every reason that did. Angela Brooks had cleaned rooms for 22 years in a hospital on the south side of Chicago and used to say there were 2 kinds of invisible people in America, the ones the world forgot by accident and the ones it trained itself not to see. Naomi had understood that sentence before she was old enough to spell it. She had grown up in apartments where heat came late in winter and church dresses were passed down from cousins, where bills were folded under sugar bowls and every good shirt had to last longer than it should. She had also grown up with rules. Keep your voice even. Keep your hands visible. Do your work twice as well, and let the silence judge itself. Those rules had gotten her through school, Through 2 jobs after community college, through a layoff in Milwaukee, through a sick aunt in St. Louis, and finally to Manhattan, where she cleaned the offices of people who gave speeches about equity under framed photographs that never once looked like her family. The elevator opened to the lower level with a low sigh. The corridor beyond was lined with concrete walls painted an honest kind of beige, the kind no one mistook for elegance. A vending machine buzzed near the break room. Somewhere down the hall, a laundry cart rattled over a threshold. Naomi stepped out, and the silence here felt different from upstairs. Not colder, just tired. Dana led her toward the small employee office near receiving. On the bulletin board outside were notices about shift coverage, bus route changes, and a flyer for discounted flu shots. Real life. The kind that did not fit into annual reports. You can collect your things, Dana said gently. We will need your badge, keys, and apron before the end of the hour. Naomi almost smiled at that. She had already left the badge and the apron behind. All that was left now was a canvas tote in her locker, a paperback with a bent spine, and the brown sweater she wore on the train ride home when the late-night air turned sharp along Lexington Avenue. I do not have much, she said. Dana gave a small, regretful nod. Most good people do not, at least not in places like this. Naomi was about to answer when a sharp memory passed through her, sudden and clean. The old envelope lodged behind the credenza, the corner of it caught in dust, the weight of it in her hand, and one detail she had not thought about until now. Not just the paper, not just the ink, the handwriting. She stopped walking. Dana took another step, then turned. What is it? Naomi stared at the concrete floor for one beat, then lifted her eyes. That letter was not left there by accident, she said. Someone hid it. Upstairs, 27 floors above the loading dock and the mop closets and the humming fluorescent lights, the woman who believed she had restored order was still alone with the one thing in the room she could not control, and for the first time since stepping off the elevator, Naomi felt something other than humiliation move through her chest. It was not hope. Not yet. It was the colder, steadier thing that came before hope. Recognition. The truth had not reached the wrong desk. It had reached the right one at the exact wrong time. Naomi followed Dana Ellis into the employee office beside receiving, where the fluorescent lights buzzed with the tired honesty of places no executive ever photographed for an annual report. A metal table stood against one wall with a coffee machine that had long ago given up pretending to make good coffee. 2 folding chairs sat beneath a bulletin board crowded with bus schedules, overtime sign-up sheets, and a faded flyer about free blood pressure screenings at a clinic in Queens. Naomi set her tote on the table and stood there for a second, letting the quiet settle. It was strange how quickly a building could tell you exactly who mattered inside it. Upstairs there had been glass, skyline, orchids, and the expensive hush of people protecting reputations. Down here there was concrete, detergent, and the soft rattle of a pallet jack somewhere in the loading bay. Dana remained by the door, giving Naomi the kind of privacy that still knew it belonged to policy. If there is anything you want noted in your file, she said, I can add a statement. Naomi opened her locker and reached for her brown sweater, folding it over one arm with the same care she had used on the envelope. Would it matter? She asked. Dana did not answer immediately, and that was answer enough. Naomi slipped the paperback novel into her bag, then paused with her hand on the cold locker door. That cabinet in her office, she said, still looking inside as if the shelves might hold a better version of the day. It is built almost flush to the wall. Heavy wood. Fixed feet. The gap behind it is narrow. Too narrow for that envelope to slide there on its own. Dana frowned slightly. You are sure? Naomi closed the locker and turned. I clean that room twice a week. I know what belongs there, what moves, what gathers dust, what is not. Somebody put it there. The room went still after that. Not dramatically. Just enough for the refrigerator in the corner to sound louder than it had before. Dana's expression changed in the subtle way careful people changed when a story they were trying to survive started becoming something they might have to answer for. You should have said that upstairs, she murmured. Naomi lifted one shoulder. She was not listening for facts. She was listening for permission to be offended. Dana looked away. On the table beside Naomi's tote lay a loose inventory form and a pen with the company logo. Sterling Biotech. Clean lines. Blue ink. The kind of branding that promised compassion in polished fonts while people disappeared quietly in service hallways. Naomi zipped her bag and picked it up. There was something else, she said. The envelope felt heavier on one side, like there was more than paper inside. Dana's eyes narrowed a fraction. Before she could respond, a voice crackled over the small wall intercom near the door. Dana Ellis, please report to the 27th floor. The message repeated once, flatter the second time. Dana straightened. Stay here, she said, though both of them knew Naomi no longer worked for anyone in that building. Upstairs, Victoria Sterling finally sat down at her desk, but the room no longer felt restored. It felt watched. The leather chair creaked softly as she reached for the envelope with the irritation of someone determined to prove a point even to a piece of paper. She had intended to hand it to legal unopened. That was still the sensible thing. That was still the controlled thing. Yet the moment her fingers touched the old cream stock, something in her chest tightened for reasons she did not care to name. The paper was thick, old-fashioned, almost personal in a way modern office correspondence never was. She turned it over once, then back again, and only then noticed what she had missed before, a second line beneath her name, written smaller and in darker ink, as if it had been added later with a steadier hand and a more urgent heart. Victoria stared at the words until the whole office seemed to fall away around them. If Naomi Brooks is the one who found this, listen to her. Victoria Sterling read the line once, then again, and for the first time that afternoon the certainty in her posture loosened by a fraction. If Naomi Brooks is the one who found this, listen to her. The office seemed to grow quieter around those words, as if even the air had stepped back to see what she would do next. She lowered herself into the chair behind the desk, not with ease, but with the slow control of someone who suddenly no longer trusted her own instincts. Outside the glass walls, movement had returned to the floor in cautious, borrowed motions. People were walking, typing, answering phones, pretending the scene from 15 minutes ago had already become company history. But inside the office, the silence remained. Victoria turned the envelope over in her hands. The paper was heavier than it should have been, thick and old, with a crease along one side as though it had been folded years ago, and then hidden where time could harden it. She slipped one finger beneath the flap and hesitated. It annoyed her, that hesitation. She was not afraid of paper. She was not the kind of woman who flinched from information. Yet the handwriting on the front had unsettled her in a way she could not explain. Not because she recognized it fully, but because some part of her almost did. She opened the envelope with careful fingers and drew out a single folded page. Something small and rigid shifted inside with a soft click against the desk. A flash drive. Victoria stared at it for 1 second before setting it aside and unfolding the letter. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but the ink remained dark and steady. Dear Victoria, if you are reading this, then 2 things have already happened. I am gone, and someone braver than I ever was has forced this family to face what it buried. Victoria felt the breath leave her chest in a quiet, unwelcome rush. She knew that phrasing, the measured cadence, the impossible mixture of authority and regret. It was her father's voice, even before her eyes reached the signature at the bottom of the page. Richard Sterling. Her hand tightened around the paper. For a moment, she did not read further. She simply stared at the name while memories rose without permission. Her father at the head of long dinner tables. Her father adjusting his cuff links before board meetings. Her father saying that legacy was not what people said about you, but what survived you in polished stone and quarterly growth. He had been dead for 3 years. A private service in Connecticut. Closed casket. Rain on black umbrellas. She had given the eulogy herself. Now his voice sat in her hand, alive in ink. Slowly, Victoria forced herself onward. There was a woman who worked in this company long before you ever knew what these hallways cost people. Her name was Angela Brooks. She was competent, dignified, and better than the place we made for her. I let men around me reduce her to a problem because it was convenient, and because I mistook silence for leadership. If her daughter Naomi is the one standing nearest this truth, then history has more mercy than I deserve. Victoria stopped reading. The room blurred for a second, not dramatically, just enough for the skyline outside the windows to soften at the edges. Brooks. Naomi Brooks. Her mind moved quickly now, rearranging details she had dismissed only minutes earlier. The woman in the gray uniform. The stillness in her face. The sentence she had spoken before being led away. I was careful. Victoria looked toward the unopened flash drive, then back to the letter. Beneath the page, tucked into the fold, another line had been written in smaller script. What was hidden in this office was not hidden from thieves. It was hidden from the truth. Victoria sat very still. 27 floors below her, in a concrete room near receiving, the woman she had humiliated was gathering her things while the old architecture of power went on pretending it had simply followed procedure. But up here, with the letter open and her father's guilt laid plain across her desk, Victoria felt something colder than embarrassment move through her. It was the first crack in a certainty she had worn for years, and it sounded, in that glass office, almost exactly like shame. Victoria read the next page more slowly, as though pace alone might soften what the words were doing to her. Her father had written in the same restrained hand he had used for board notes and birthday cards, the same hand that once signed scholarships, acquisitions, and condolence letters with equal neatness, as if order itself were proof of goodness. It was not. She knew that now because the page in front of her said what no Sterling had ever said plainly. Angela Brooks was pushed out of this company under language designed to sound lawful and respectable. The truth was simpler and uglier. She was treated as disposable because she was a black woman in a building run by men who liked her labor more than her presence. Victoria's throat tightened. She read the sentence twice, then a third time, and each time it seemed to strip another polished layer off the room around her. The walnut desk, the framed awards, the skyline spreading blue and silver over Manhattan. All of it suddenly looked arranged rather than earned. Her father's letter continued without self-pity, which somehow made it worse. He wrote that Angela had discovered irregular purchase orders linked to a facilities expansion project nearly 20 years earlier, numbers that did not reconcile, invoices that moved through shell vendors, approvals signed by people who never touched the work. She had brought questions to the wrong office at the wrong time and had been repaid with suspicion, isolation, and eventually a quiet removal disguised as restructuring. Richard Sterling admitted that he had known enough to stop it and had chosen the safety of reputation over the cost of truth. Victoria leaned back in her chair and stared at the city beyond the glass, but the city offered nothing. Below, traffic moved in thin ribbons. A helicopter crossed the river in the distance. Somewhere in the office, her phone vibrated once against the desk and went ignored. She thought of Naomi standing in front of her only minutes earlier, still and dignified in that gray uniform, while Victoria had spoken to her like she was a stain that had found its way onto expensive fabric. Naomi Brooks. Angela Brooks. The names sat beside each other now with a terrible clarity. Victoria looked down and kept reading. If Naomi is the one who found this, it means the pattern did not die with my generation. It adapted. Someone in this company still believes hidden things are safest when they can be blamed on the invisible. The sentence landed with a chill so precise it felt physical. Victoria's eyes moved to the small flash drive lying beside the letter. Its plastic casing was plain black, unmarked except for a strip of silver tape on one side. She picked it up and noticed that her fingers were no longer steady. On the tape, in her father's handwriting, was one word: proof. A sound at the door made her look up. Marlene stood there, careful, uncertain. Ms. Sterling, Dana Ellis is here. Victoria folded the letter once, then stopped and opened it again, unwilling now to crease anything that had managed to survive this long. Send her in, she said. Dana entered with the cautious posture of someone expecting to confirm a termination, not interrupt a reckoning. Victoria did not waste time. Where is Naomi Brooks? Dana blinked. Near receiving, I think. She was collecting her things. Victoria set the letter flat on the desk, beside the unopened drive, and the quiet that followed felt different from the one earlier. This was no longer the silence of power being challenged. It was the silence of power discovering it had been standing on rot. Do not process her out, Victoria said. Not yet. Dana's eyes flicked to the paper, then back to Victoria's face, and something in her expression sharpened with alarm. May I ask why? Victoria looked at the words her father had left her and answered without the shield of executive tone for the first time all day. Because I may have just humiliated the only honest person in this building. Down near receiving, Naomi sat on the edge of a metal chair with her tote bag at her feet and her sweater folded across her lap, waiting for the kind of ending buildings like this preferred: quiet, efficient, and out of sight. The employee office hummed softly around her. A vending machine buzzed in the corridor. Somewhere beyond the concrete wall, a loading dock door rolled open with a long metallic groan, then slammed shut again. She kept her hands folded, but her mind would not stay still. It kept returning to the envelope, to the weight of it, to the way the paper had felt unbalanced in her palm, as if something more than a letter had been tucked inside. Upstairs, Victoria Sterling closed her office door herself this time. She did not want witnesses for what came next. She inserted the flash drive into her laptop with a hand that was steadier only because she forced it to be. For one breath, nothing happened. Then a folder opened on the screen. Purchase orders. Internal security logs. Facilities access overrides. Audio. Victoria stared at the file names while a cold pressure spread beneath her ribs. She clicked the audio first. The recording was old enough to carry a faint static hiss, but the voices were clear. A man she recognized immediately as her father spoke first, low and strained. Another voice followed, smoother, younger, careful in the way dangerous men often sounded when they believed they were being reasonable. It took Victoria only 3 sentences to place it. Calvin Reed, their current chief financial officer. 2 decades younger, but unmistakable. The conversation was brief and devastating. Angela Brooks had seen numbers she was not supposed to see. She had asked questions about duplicate invoices routed through shell vendors connected to a renovation contractor. Calvin had suggested reassigning her before she became a problem. Richard Sterling had not agreed out loud, but neither had he stopped it. The recording ended with a silence that sounded more guilty than any confession. Victoria sat frozen, the pale light from the monitor reflecting in her eyes. She opened the security logs next. Access records. Old archives. A pattern of late-night entries into executive storage under temporary override codes. One name appeared. Again and again on approval trails tied to those codes. Calvin Reed. Another folder held scanned memos and one photograph, grainy but clear enough. A younger Angela Brooks standing in a service hallway beside a rolling supply cart. Her face turned toward the camera by accident. Expression guarded, dignified, unaware she was being reduced to evidence in someone else's scheme. Victoria felt something in her chest fold inward at the sight of her. Same high cheekbones Naomi carried. Same stillness around the mouth. The resemblance was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was intimate. It made history personal in a way reports never could. A knock came at the door. Marlene's voice followed, softer than before. Miss Sterling, Mr. Reed is asking if you are still joining the 6 o'clock budget review. Victoria looked at the photograph, then at the ledger entries lined across her screen like a row of quiet crimes. Tell him I will be late, she said. Her voice sounded different to her own ears, stripped of its usual polished edge. And Marlene, she added, do not let him in here. The pause outside the door lasted 1 second too long. Yes, ma'am. Downstairs, Dana Ellis returned to the employee office more quickly than Naomi expected. There was color in her face now, and uncertainty too, but not the earlier kind. This was sharper. Naomi, she said, almost breathless, do not leave yet. Naomi lifted her eyes slowly. I was already told to leave. Dana shook her head. That changed. Naomi studied her for a moment, hearing the freight elevator rumble somewhere overhead, hearing the old building shift around them like a chest taking in air before speech. Changed because of the letter? She asked. Dana did not answer directly, but she did not need to. The silence between them told the truth plainly enough. Upstairs, in a glass office washed in evening light, Victoria Sterling looked at the evidence her father had hidden and understood at last that Naomi had not crossed into the wrong room. She had walked straight into the center of a lie that had been waiting 20 years to be seen. Victoria did not realize she was holding her breath until the office phone lit up again and the shrill vibration against the desk broke the spell of the screen. Calvin Reed. His name glowed there with the calm confidence of a man who had spent years moving through danger by dressing it as administration. Victoria let it ring out. Then she stood, crossed to the wall panel beside her credenza, and pressed the command for internal camera archives. If her father had been right, if Naomi had been right, then the truth would not only live in old files and buried audio. It would have left a shape in the present. The monitor split into tiled footage from the executive floor. Victoria selected the camera outside her office and scrubbed back through the hour. There she was, leaving for the investor call at 5:12, heels precise, assistant trailing behind with a tablet. 5 minutes later, the corridor sat empty under white light, polished and still. Then Naomi appeared, pushing her blue cart slowly past the office door, shoulders squared from habit, not entitlement. Victoria leaned closer. Naomi paused at the baseboard near the window side of the office and bent down, disappearing partly from view behind the cart. When she rose again, there was something cream-colored in her hand. She stared at it for a second, not with curiosity, but with recognition, the way people look at an object that does not belong where it is. Victoria watched Naomi glance down both ends of the corridor. No one was there. Naomi stepped into the office, moving carefully, almost reluctantly, like a woman entering a church that had never invited her. She crossed to the desk and placed the envelope in the center, smoothing it once with her fingertips. Then she turned as if to leave. That was the moment Victoria had entered. The footage rolled on in silent cruelty. Naomi had not opened drawers, had not searched cabinets, had not touched anything except the letter and the edge of the desk where she steadied herself. She had done exactly what she said she had done. Victoria sat back down slowly, but the chair felt different now, less like authority and more like a witness stand. Shame moved through her in layers. First the obvious one, that she had been wrong. Then the worse one, that she had been wrong in a way that came too easily. She had not needed proof to accuse Naomi. She had needed only a uniform, a black woman in her office, and a lifetime of assumptions refined into instinct. Outside the windows, dusk had deepened over Manhattan. The sky was now the color of bruised silver, and the first office lights in neighboring towers had begun to glow. Inside her own office, the reflection in the glass showed a woman who looked composed until you saw her hands. One rested on the desk beside the old photograph of Angela Brooks on the screen. The other covered her mouth, not dramatically, just enough to hold something in. A soft knock came at the door. Then Marlene entered before being asked, her face pale. "Ms. Sterling," she said carefully, "Mr. Reed is on his way up. He said the budget review cannot wait." Victoria turned her head. "Stop him." Marlene hesitated. "I tried." That was all Victoria needed to hear. She stood just as the outer office doors opened and Calvin Reed's voice carried in, smooth and practiced, asking why the executive floor suddenly felt like a locked courthouse. Victoria looked once more at the security footage frozen on Naomi's still figure beside the desk, the envelope in her hand, dignity intact even in silence. Then she picked up the letter, slid the flash drive into her pocket, and understood with a clarity that left no room for comfort that this was no longer about what her father had done 20 years ago. It was about what she would do in the next 60 seconds. Calvin Reed entered the executive suite with the polished impatience of a man who had spent 20 years confusing access with innocence. His charcoal suit fit perfectly, his silver tie sat straight against a crisp white shirt, and his expression carried that familiar kind of confidence executives wore when they believed every problem would eventually bow to tone, timing, and legal language. He stopped at Victoria's doorway and gave the room a quick, practice scan. The open laptop. The old paper on the desk. Marlene standing too still outside. Something in his face shifted, not enough for panic, just enough for instinct. "You missed the budget review," he said, keeping his voice light. "The board is waiting." Victoria did not invite him to sit. She remained standing behind the desk with the letter in one hand and the city darkening behind her in the glass. "Close the door," she said. Calvin smiled faintly, as if this were a private disagreement about scheduling, not a fault line opening under his shoes. He shut the door with quiet precision and turned back toward her. "All right," he said. "What is this really about?" Victoria picked up the remote and turned the monitor toward him. The paused security footage filled the screen. Naomi Brooks entering the office with the envelope in her hand, placing it in the center of the desk, then turning to leave. No rummaging. No theft. No hesitation that looked like guilt. Just care. Calvin's eyes moved across the image once, then returned to Victoria's face. "You had security pull footage over a facilities complaint," he asked. "Interesting use of executive time." Victoria set the remote down. "It stopped being a facilities issue when I realized I had accused the wrong person, and the right one has been hiding in plain sight for 20 years. That landed. Not loudly, but she saw it in the way his jaw tightened before he smoothed it away. Calvin took one measured step forward. Victoria, if this is about some old document your father left behind, I would urge you to be careful. Men of his generation carried guilt like souvenirs. They preserved it. They embroidered it. It does not always mean the facts are usable. Victoria almost laughed, but there was no humor in her chest. Usable, she repeated. That is an interesting word. She lifted the letter slightly. My father names Angela Brooks. He names you. He describes shell vendors, late-night access overrides, and the removal of a woman who asked the wrong questions. Calvin's expression stayed calm, yet something flatter had entered his eyes now, something colder than charm. Your father was under pressure in those years, he said. Facilities expansion was messy. Vendors changed. Records were incomplete. If a staff employee misunderstood procurement flows, that is unfortunate, but not criminal. Victoria reached into her pocket and placed the black flash drive on the desk between them. The small plastic rectangle made almost no sound at all, yet the room seemed to hear it. There is audio, she said. There are access logs. There are purchase records tied to override codes you approved. For the first time, Calvin did not answer immediately. The silence that followed was not empty. It was calculating. He moved his gaze from the flash drive to the windows, to the door, to the desk, as if measuring exits that were no longer physical. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. It was still smooth, but the softness was gone. Then let me save you from making this worse, he said. Do you understand what happens if those files leave this office? Investors will hear fraud before they hear timeline. The press will tie your father's name to discrimination, corruption, and concealment. The Sterling Foundation will collapse under the headlines. Your stock will bleed by morning, and you will be remembered, not as the woman who inherited a company, but as the one who destroyed it. Victoria stood very still. She looked at him, then at the frozen image of Naomi on the screen, then back at the man who had spent decades trusting that fear would do his work for him. No, she said, her voice quiet enough to make him lean in. I will be remembered as the woman who decided it stops with me. Then she pressed the button on her desk phone and said, without taking her eyes off Calvin Reed, Marlene, call outside counsel, internal audit, and building security. And find Naomi Brooks before she walks out that door. The moment Victoria released the desk phone, the room changed shape around Calvin Reed. Not because anyone shouted. Not because alarms sounded. Because power, once it stops protecting a lie, leaves a man standing in plain light with nothing but his own face. He did not lunge for the drive or argue louder. He did something colder than that. He straightened his cuffs and let a small, disappointed smile touch his mouth, as if Victoria had failed a test he had expected her to pass. You are making an emotional decision, he said. That is dangerous in a public company. Victoria looked at him with a steadiness she had not possessed an hour earlier. No, she said. An emotional decision was humiliating a woman because I found her easier to doubt than myself. Outside the office, footsteps approached, quick but controlled. 2 security officers appeared at the glass wall with Marlene behind them. Her tablet clutched to her chest like a shield she had only just realized she needed. Calvin glanced toward them and exhaled through his nose. Be careful, he said, voice low now. Once this starts, you do not get to choose where it ends. Victoria thought of her father's letter, of Angela Brooks in a grainy hallway photograph, of Naomi standing in silence while accusation filled the room around her. No, she said again, softer this time. But I do get to choose whether it starts with another lie. She handed one officer the flash drive and the printed copies of the archived logs she had pulled from the system. Mr. Reed is not to leave the floor until outside counsel arrives, she said. Calvin did not resist. He only looked at her with the flat, almost pitying gaze of a man who still believed truth was for idealists and consequences were for everyone else. Then the officers guided him toward the conference suite, not roughly, not theatrically, just firmly enough to show the building had finally remembered what security was supposed to mean. The second the door shut behind him, Victoria moved. She grabbed her coat, left the letter on her desk only long enough to slide it into a leather folio, and crossed the executive floor with none of her usual measured elegance. Her heels struck the marble in quick, uneven beats that made assistants turn their heads. She did not care. In the service elevator, she saw herself in the steel reflection and barely recognized the woman there. Hair still perfect, jacket still crisp, but the eyes were different, less certain, more awake. The elevator dropped floor by floor, away from the skyline and the boardrooms and the language of managed appearances. When the doors opened to the lower level, the air felt warmer, heavier, touched by detergent and cardboard and the honest fatigue of people who did not get stock options for carrying a building through the night. Down the corridor near receiving, Naomi Brooks stood beside the service exit with her tote on one shoulder and her brown sweater folded over one arm. Dana Ellis was speaking to her in low tones, but Naomi's expression had already gone distant in the way people looked when they were preparing themselves to leave something without letting it bruise them any further. Then Victoria's footsteps entered the hallway, sharp against concrete, and both women turned. For one brief second, nobody spoke. A forklift beeped somewhere in the loading bay. A fluorescent light flickered above the break room door. Naomi looked at Victoria the way she had in the office, not intimidated, not welcoming, simply steady. Victoria stopped 6 feet away and felt the full weight of how far those 6 feet really were. Upstairs, she had stood behind a desk and let position speak for her. Down here, there was no walnut, no skyline, no glass between them. Only a service corridor, tired light, and the truth stripped down to 2 women breathing the same air. Victoria opened her mouth once and closed it again. The apology she had assumed would come easily now felt too small, too polished, too late. Naomi waited, one hand resting on the strap of her bag. Finally, Victoria said the only honest thing she had. I was wrong. Naomi's face did not change. Yes, she said quietly. The word was not cruel. That made it harder to bear. Victoria took another step, careful this time, as if approaching something fragile she had no right to touch. I read the letter, she said, and I saw the footage. You told the truth. I did not. Naomi held her gaze. That is not the whole truth. Victoria felt that sentence land before she even understood it. Naomi's voice remained calm, but there was an old weariness inside it now, the kind that came from recognizing patterns before other people recognized moments. You were not angry because I entered your office, she said. You were angry because someone like me crossed a line you thought only money could cross. The words did not echo in the service corridor, but Victoria felt them settle into everything around her anyway, into the concrete walls, the humming fluorescent lights, the steel door with chipped paint near the loading dock, the whole lower level of the building she had spent years governing without ever really entering. You were angry because someone like me crossed a line you thought only money could cross. Victoria lowered her eyes for one brief second, not out of defeat, but because there was no honest way to meet that sentence with defense. Dana Ellis stood off to the side, silent now, understanding that this was no longer an employment issue and had not been for a long time. It was a reckoning, and those did not belong to human resources. Victoria drew the leather folio against her side and spoke more carefully than she ever had in a boardroom. You are right, she said. And I think part of me knew it, even while I was saying those things to you. Naomi watched her without softening. Not cold, just clear. Knowing after is not the same as seeing before. Victoria nodded once. I know. For a moment, neither woman moved. The sounds around them grew strangely precise. The low buzz of the vending machine. The roll of a dolly somewhere beyond the receiving bay. The soft clink of keys against Dana's badge clip. Ordinary sounds. Honest sounds. They made the polished cruelty upstairs feel even farther away. Victoria opened the folio and took out the letter, already creased now from being held too tightly. This was written by my father, she said. It names your mother, Angela Brooks. Naomi's fingers tightened around the strap of her tote, just enough for Victoria to notice. That was the first visible crack in her stillness. My mother worked here, Naomi said, but it was not a question. It sounded like something she had carried for years without proof, a family truth worn thin by silence. Victoria stepped forward only enough to offer the page, not enough to invade what little safety the corridor allowed. Naomi looked at the letter before she touched it, as if paper itself could wound when it arrived too late. Then she took it. Her eyes moved across the first line slowly. Victoria did not interrupt. The fluorescent light above them flickered once, then steadied. Naomi kept reading. Her face changed in small ways instead of dramatic ones, a tightening in the jaw, a pause at her mother's name, a breath taken deeper than the ones before it. When she finished, she lowered the letter without looking up. She told me, Naomi said quietly, that they made her feel like asking the truth was the same thing as breaking the rules. Victoria swallowed. She was right. Naomi finally lifted her eyes again. There was pain there now, but dignity had not left it. And today you did the same thing to me. Victoria let that stand between them. She did not rush to smooth it over. Yes, she said. I did. Then she told her everything plainly, because plain truth was the least she owed now. Calvin Reed had been stopped on the executive floor. Outside counsel and internal audit were on their way. The archived records were preserved. Her father's recording had been copied. No file would be buried again. Naomi listened without expression until Victoria reached the last part. I want to reopen what happened to your mother, Victoria said. Officially. Publicly, if necessary. And I want your termination reversed immediately, though I understand if that is not enough, or if this is no longer a place you want to stay. Naomi looked down at the letter in her hands, at the old ink carrying a dead man's guilt into a corridor where it could no longer hide behind walnut desks and glass walls. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but it cut cleaner than anger. Do not offer me this job like it erases what happened, she said. Offer the truth because it should have been given before either of us got here. Victoria felt that land somewhere deeper than apology could reach. Then that is what I am offering, she said. Not as a favor, as a debt. Naomi folded the letter carefully along its old lines and slipped it into her tote. Then she looked past Victoria, up toward the invisible floors above them, toward the offices where people like her were expected to clean the glass, but never touch what was behind it. All right, she said at last. Then let us see whether your company knows the difference between being embarrassed and being changed. They went back upstairs together, not side by side exactly, but not separated by rank anymore either. Victoria stood in the service elevator with her coat unbuttoned and the leather folio tucked against her ribs, while Naomi held her tote close and watched the floor numbers climb through brushed steel reflections that made both women look slightly ghosted, as if the building itself was still deciding how to see them. When the doors opened on 27, the executive floor no longer felt invincible. The lights were the same. The marble was the same. The skyline still spread beyond the glass in blue-black bands over Manhattan. But the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of people protecting power. It was the silence of people sensing that power had finally been asked to explain itself. Marlene rose from her desk the moment they stepped out. Behind her, two members of outside counsel were speaking in low voices near the conference suite, and an internal auditor stood with a legal pad open, no longer pretending this was a scheduling issue. Through the glass wall at the end of the corridor, Calvin Reed sat alone at the long conference table under recessed lights, shoulders straight, jaw set, the posture of a man still trying to look like a misunderstanding instead of a pattern. Victoria did not look at him first. She looked at Naomi. You do not have to come any farther than you want to, she said. Naomi took in the floor, the polished desks, the careful faces turning away too late, and then she answered with the calm that had carried her through every room that had ever asked her to shrink. I came this far already. Victoria gave one small nod. Then she walked to the center of the executive floor and said, clearly enough for every assistant, analyst, and department head still lingering after hours to hear. Before anyone leaves tonight, there is something I need to correct. The words stopped the room more effectively than anger ever had. A printer went quiet. A chair stopped rolling. Even the city beyond the glass seemed to hold still for one beat. Victoria turned, not toward the board portraits on the wall, not toward the conference suite where Calvin waited under watch, but toward Naomi Brooks in her gray uniform and practical shoes, standing beneath the same white light that had judged her earlier. This afternoon, Victoria said, her voice steady though not untouched, I accused an innocent employee of misconduct because I trusted my assumptions more than the truth standing in front of me. Naomi Brooks entered my office to return evidence that exposed serious wrongdoing inside this company. She acted with integrity. I did not. No one moved. No one rescued her from the sentence. Good, she thought. Let it stand. She continued, simpler now, without executive polish to hide behind. Her mother, Angela Brooks, was wronged here years ago. That wrong was buried. It ends now. The internal auditor lowered his pen for a second, perhaps because even in a building built on memos and controlled language, some truths arrive too plainly to be summarized. Victoria stepped to Naomi and held out a new badge holder, still blank, along with the company apron Dana had retrieved from the cart downstairs. Naomi looked at both items, then at Victoria. "I am not taking this as gratitude," she said softly. "Then do not," Victoria answered. "Take it only if and when this place becomes worthy of your work." That was the first moment a change came over Naomi's face. Not forgiveness, not quite, but a loosening at the corners of her eyes, as if the night had offered one honest thing after too many rehearsed ones. She took the old letter from her tote instead of the apron and laid it on Victoria's desk where the envelope had first been found. Cream paper against dark walnut. Past against present. "Start there," Naomi said. "Not with me. With her." Victoria placed her hand over the letter, not covering it, just acknowledging its weight. Outside, the city lights glittered across the river like broken glass catching moonlight. Inside, the executive floor stood in a stillness so complete that even breath seemed audible. Naomi turned then and walked back toward the service elevator, not hurried, not dramatic, just quiet and upright, carrying nothing from the room except the truth she had forced it to face. Victoria did not stop her. She only stood beside the desk and watched the elevator doors close softly around the woman she had mistaken for invisible. The office smelled faintly of lemon cleanser and paper warmed by lamplight. And under the cold shine of the city, with her